Hey there guys, I am the Six Machine and welcome back to another Warhammer video. As always, if you do enjoy these Warhammer videos, please do consider subscribing to the channel. It really does help me out, and if you have any units or rules that you would like me to talk about and discuss and review, then do let me know in the comments below and I will get to them as soon as I possibly can. Continuing our Dark Angels theme today, we're going to be doing another unit overview and review, and this time we're taking a look at a unit that was really awful, to be honest, in 8th edition, but has had quite a resurgence in popularity since the Dark Angel supplement came out. And I've been seeing them crop up in lists all over the place recently, and some people have even been taking 3 of them in their lists now. They are just that good. And we are, of course, talking about the Land Speed of Vengeance. Now, as I said, this was previously something which you pretty much never saw on the tabletop, being a bit pricey and having honestly one of the worst weapons in the entire game, with their generic heavy d6, strength 7, minus 3 AP, 2 damage, which could be overcharged, but if you rolled a 1 to hit, not only did you take 3 mortal wounds, but you also couldn't use the weapon for the rest of the game. It was just awful. Really, really awful. But it has had a significant improvement in the move over to 9th edition, so let's dive in and take a look at this unit, as usual looking at the stat line, the abilities, the offensive and defensive capabilities of the Vengeance, and then deciding whether it will be a good fit to your Dark Angels list. At 120 points, it is a decent bit more than a regular land speeder that other marine chapters can take, in fact being double the points of a standard single heavy bolter land speeder, but for that extra 60 points, you get not a bad profile with a movement of 12, weapon and ballistic skill of 3+, strength 4, toughness 6, a really useful 9 wounds, 3 attacks and a 3-up save. This puts the Vengeance in a great spot where it is just below the wounds characteristic, which would mean that it brackets. So you get the full profile of this guy until he dies, unlike things like the more recent Storm Speeders, which have 10 wounds, so they actually get worse in terms of their ballistic skill, their movement and their attacks as they take more damage. So even though on the face of it, it might seem like a net negative for the Vengeance to have less wounds than the newer speeders, I actually consider it overall very much a buff for the overall usefulness of the Vengeance across the course of the entire game in comparison to things like the Storm Speeders. As usual, when we look at units, it does have the Angels of Death rule, which, as usual, provides no benefit from And They Shall Know No Fear or Bolter Discipline. It's also, let's be honest, not really going to get much use out of Shock Assault if this unit does end up in melee. You probably have bigger things to worry about. And then finally we have Combat Doctrines, which actually is quite a useful little buff to all of the weapon options that the Vengeance can take. It does also have the Explodes rule, which does D3 mortal wounds to all units within D6 inches if you roll a 6 when it dies, so do watch out for that. Or alternatively, like a lot of fast moving vehicles, if you know it's probably going to die on a given turn, or you know that it's going to take a lot of fire, or it's got a couple of wounds left, honestly don't be afraid to move it right up point blank into your enemy lines, just to try and get those few clutch mortal wounds to a few of your enemy's units as a last middle finger to them before you die. The final rule that the Vengeance comes with is the biggest one in my opinion, and of course it is part of the Raven Wing and does indeed come with the Jink keyword, giving it not only a huge survivability boost against the heavy anti-tank and anti-vehicle weapons which will likely be fired at it by granting it a 5-up invulnerable save as long as you didn't stay still in your turn, but also boosting that up to an amazing 4-up invuln if you chose to advance. As I've said before, this is a really fantastic rule and really helpful in increasing the durability of your probably quite small, quite elite Ravenwing force. But even if you're not going pure Ravenwing and you are just adding the Vengeance to, give some more fire support to your Green Wing or your Deathwing lists, it's a really great rule to have, knowing that you have that backup, meaning that things like las cannons or melters or dark lancers, or even things like missile launchers in Devastator Doctrine won't be pushing you to having a 6-up save, or in the case of things like Melter, removing it altogether. which means that your Vengeance is much more likely to survive a round of shooting in the event you don't get turn 1. It is also worth noting on that point, however, is that the Vengeance does have the fly keyword. So if you do want to be completely cautious, I would honestly recommend putting this guy behind some line of sight blocking terrain when you deploy, and then just flying him out and over it in your turn, so that even though you do have that 3 up armor save and that 5 up invuln, you're even more survivable if obviously your enemy can't shoot you at all. So trying to make yourself totally safe from enemy fire is a much more preferable option if you can. But still, it's nice to know that even if you can't because of how your enemy's deployed or how the terrain on the board is set up, you do have that 5 up or that 4 up invulnerable from Jink, which is better than nothing. The fact that you have to keep moving with the Vengeance to keep that 5 up invuln does make the Dark Angel's chapter tactic of Grim Resolve relatively pointless, as although going to hitting on 2s if you stay still is a really nice buff, I would honestly say that unless your enemy has got no firepower, which is scaring your Vengeance, like they just have las guns or something, or you are planning on using one of the stratagems, which we'll mention later, I would personally much rather keep that 5 up invulnerable save instead of getting the +1 to hit. But again, it's worth noting that if the game is nearly ending and you desperately need to shift that final enemy squad off an objective to win, perhaps not moving and making sure that your shots do get that +1 to hit may be worth potentially sacrificing your Vengeance for. And now you may be thinking the second part of Jink, getting a 4 up invuln if you advance, isn't all that useful, seeing as how the weapons on the Vengeance are all heavy, but that's where the Dark Angel's Sons of the Lions ability comes in again. And as the Vengeance is a Raven Wing model, it does benefit from Speed of the Raven. So what this lets you do is not only add 3 inches to the movement of Ravenwing models in the Devastator Doctrine, immediately pushing your Vengeance up to a 15-inch move instead of 12 right off the bat, but also when you advance in Devastator Doctrine, you can still make a shooting attack and just suffer the penalty as if you were firing an assault weapon. So what that means is with your Vengeance, you can sit it behind some line of sight blocking terrain to avoid your enemy's turn 1 firepower, and then in your turn dash it out, moving at least 12 inches but potentially up to 21 inches if you advance, and then still unleash all of your firepower, albeit hitting on 4s instead of 3s, but still being able to put a good amount of damage into your enemy's units. And what I really like about this rule is that it lets your Vengeance, and to be honest, most Dark Angel units, especially Ravenwing, deliver a really powerful counterpunch in your turn while still letting you deploy very defensively to help protect you from your enemy's Alpha Strike. And I'll say this again, but I think this ability is quite possibly one of the best Super Doctrine abilities out of any of the Space Marine armies, and it's something that the Vengeance can 100% make some really good use out of. And in terms of delivering that counterpunch, the Land Speed of Vengeance comes with a Heavy Bolter standard for a nice 3 Strength 5 -1 AP 2 damage shots, or for an additional 5 points can upgrade this to a Heavy 6 -1 AP 1 damage Assault Cannon. And I'm pretty sure the Assault Cannon used to be a 20 point or so upgrade, so was never really worth it. And to be honest, with the change of the Heavy Bolter to 2 damage, I would still say that most of the time, you're better sticking with that and keeping the Vengeance at its nice 120 point price tag. But it's worth noting that if you do need some more anti-infantry firepower, or you have a lot of Orcs or Tyranids or Guard in your meta, then the Assault Cannon can be a nice little addition to help you thin down the hordes, especially in a pure Ravenwing list when your army is going to be, as I've said before, quite small and elite anyway, so having that extra ability to mow down bigger numbers and bigger squads is quite useful. The main weapon of the Vengeance, however, is the Plasma Storm Battery. And now, as I said earlier, this used to be quite honestly the worst weapon in the entire game. It was just so punishing to use and unbelievably swingy as well. Now, though, it has had a lovely improvement from the D6 shots to a much more reliable 2D3, which gives you a lot less variance, and you can be a lot more confident in getting those 4 or so shots rather than running the risk of getting a 1 or a 2. It's also had its base strength improved from 7 to 8, and obviously the supercharged profile has gone from 8 to 9, and it's kept the -3 AP and 2 damage base, 3 damage on the overcharge. So it is a very decent option for aiming at not only elite infantry like aggressors or bikes, but especially when overcharged, a very solid choice for shooting at tanks and even toughness 8 targets like knights, with a potential 18 damage possible from the gun. And the other huge improvement on this gun is that now if you roll a 1, you don't suffer those 3 mortal wounds and then lose the gun for the rest of the game, you just take a mortal wound. That's it. So yes, you still want to be avoiding ones as much as you possibly can, but it's not the end of the world if you do roll a couple, unlike it was in 8th edition. And really, this is the change that, in my opinion, makes the Vengeance now an actually valid, usable option compared to the state it was in back in 8th. With a 36-inch range, it's also able to move out, and especially after you've moved your 12 or 15 inches, pretty much engage any target that it can see on the board. So once again, this leaves you very safe in deploying it back somewhere out of line of sight of your enemy guns, and then still be pretty confident in the knowledge that in your turn, you should be able to get it in range to shoot at whatever you need it to. And then finally, the Plasma Storm battery comes with the blast rule as well, so even against the poorer targets for this weapon like a horde of gaunts, you can at least still be guaranteed that 6 shots and be confident that you should almost certainly wipe out 5 or maybe 6 of them if you're lucky. So whilst yes, I would still say fire this on elite infantry or vehicles if you can, if you only have bigger squads or hordes as a target, then it's still not terrible at doing that because you can wipe out, as I said, a good 5th or a 6th of the squad in one go. As I mentioned earlier though, and this ties into the blast rule, don't get this thing into melee, because even though it's a vehicle, it can't fire into melee, so you will be stuck shooting 3 heavy bolter shots or 6 assault cannon shots against what has ever tied you up. So use your speed and the fly keyword to make sure that you absolutely never get this thing dragged into combat, because it will be pretty much useless against whatever manages to tag it. In terms of how to support the Vengeance with stratagems, there are a good number of useful ones to think about, both in the main Marine Codex and in the Dark Angel supplement. The first of which is the high speed focus stratagem. For 1 CP, when you allocate a ranged attack to a Ravenwing vehicle, then it gains a 4-up invuln until the start of your next turn. So, like I mentioned earlier, if you really do want to get that +1 to hit from the Grim Resolve rule, then it may be worth having a command point in your back pocket, because it's likely that your opponent will take advantage of the fact that you've lost your 5-up invulnerable for staying still. So you can just let your enemy take the shots and then say, okay, I got my 2-up to hit for standing still, and here we go, I'll just give the Vengeance a nice tasty 4-up invulnerable for your troubles. It is a nice stratagem, allowing you to make the most of both the Dark Angel's chapter tactic and still keep that survivability bonus that the Ravenwing get via Jink. Of course, if you don't want to stay still and still get that +1 to hit, you could go for targeting guidance. For 2 CP, you select an enemy unit within 18 inches of a Ravenwing land speeder, and all Dark Angel's units add +1 to their ranged hit rolls against that unit. This essentially gives your entire army +1 to hit, which is incredibly strong, and means that for Ravenwing especially, even if your entire army has advanced in your turn, you can still fire at your base ballistic skill against a unit you need to kill, and you still get that very cheeky 4-up invulnerable save thanks to advancing. It's a bit pricey at 2 CP, but again, if you want your army to be as durable as possible, and there's also an enemy unit that you absolutely need to get rid of, then targeting guidance is going to be an absolute lifesaver for you. From the main Marine Codex, you can take advantage of the Skilled Rider stratagem, as you do have the Land Speeder keyword, which for 1 command point lets you choose a unit that advanced, and enemy attacks against it suffer -1 to their hit rolls. So if you 100% want your Vengeance to survive a round of enemy fire, advance it up. If you're in Devastator Doctrine, you can still fire, but for your troubles, you not only get that 4-up invulnerable save, but you also get a -1 to hit, which lets your Vengeance tank about 16 las cannon shots before it goes down, which for a 120 point unit is some pretty good survivability. The final stratagem, which seems almost tailor-made for the Vengeance, is, you guessed it, weapons from the Dark Age. With a 2d3 shotgun doing 2 damage or 3 on the overcharge, as I said, that's potentially 18 damage against an enemy target. But what if you need to do even more than that? Well, for 2 CP, you can bump that up to 3 damage base and a pretty unbelievable 4 damage on the overcharge. And not only does this make you much better at absolutely wrecking vehicles, but it also means that you could choose to safely get to 3 damage without the risks of overcharging. So if there's an enemy squad of bikes, or inceptors, or aggressors in range, and your Vengeance is down to its last wound, you can either overcharge to get 3 damage but risk dying, or spend the 2 CP to just get the jump to 3 damage without any risk. Both options have their positives and negatives. 2 CP is a pretty hefty investment, but if you need your Vengeance to stay alive, it's definitely a useful tool to keep as an option. The land speed of Vengeance isn't core, so quite a lot of the reroll bubbles and abilities won't affect it, which is a shame, but it does mean that it's not quite as important to keep it up nice and close to your Talon Master or to Samael in a pure Ravenwing list. But I think that for 120 points, despite not getting the access to those rerolls, you do get a very decent amount of survivability and shooting potential, and if you compare it to the newer Storm Speeders, then yes, they are arguably more potent from a damage potential, especially ones like the Hammer Strike, but at 170 points, I would much rather personally keep that 3-up ballistic skill the entire game rather than have it drop to 4-up and then 5-up after taking a few wounds. And like I said before, I really like the Vengeance because it sits at that very sweet spot of survivability and cost. And whilst the Plasma Storm battery is still a little bit swingy, it's much less so than it was before. And of course, being Dark Angels and Ravenwing, you really genuinely can get this thing across the board to get a bead on a wide range of targets, from elite infantry to light armor to even heavy toughness 8 land raiders, and start to chunk off 3 or 4 damage holes from them right from turn 1. I personally like to think of them as more maneuverable and more reliable Ravenwing Vindicators. And I do genuinely think that if you need to add some punch to your Ravenwing lists and are perhaps fed up of spamming attack bikes or invader ATVs, then these will definitely fit that bill nicely, as well as give you that option to take a little bit more anti-horde weaponry as well in the assault cannon if you feel like you're lacking that. And to be honest, from what I've seen, for 120 points, bringing 3 of them honestly isn't a bad investment, giving you 27 toughness 6 wounds with a 3-up save and either a 5 or a 4-up invulnerable, and then pumping out a great number of high damage, reliable shots across the board at your enemy units for 360 points is actually really strong. But what do you think of the land speed of Vengeance? Have you been using any in 9th edition so far, and do they have a place in the world of attack bikes and multi-melter ATVs? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, as well as any stratagems, tactics or combos that I've missed that you've been using with the Vengeance. And as always, thank you very much for watching. I really do appreciate all your support. Please do like and subscribe if you would like to see more Warhammer videos from me, but until next time, I will catch you later, guys.